Hope my luck changes before the party.
So just about all the other victims represent something negative from Walter's past. But there's one exception. Walter met Eileen when she was a small child. He was homeless and sleeping in the subway station. Eileen came by with her mother, and despite her mother's warning to stay away from the creepy homeless guy, she gave him her doll because she thought he looked lonely. When she walked away with her mother, Walter cried. The scene where he relays some of this story to Henry is about the closest Walter comes to showing any kind of emotion or regret.
Long time ago. She was younger than me back then.
Notice how long he looks down at that doll, shaking his head.
She looked so happy, holding her mother's hand.
And then he gets rid of it.
Here. I'll give it to you.
Eileen is also the first person to notice that Henry might be in trouble, and really the only one who ever seems to care.
How's it going with room 302?
Yes, Eileen is a nice, sweet, caring person. In a Silent Hill game. Oh yeah, she's screwed. She does become one of Walter's victims, but he doesn't finish the job. Not that you can tell at first. Ever notice how Henry seems much more broken up over the death of the female characters than the male characters? Very soon you find out that Eileen is still alive in a hospital. Once you find her, she's a little upset.
Eileen! Eileen, relax!
That poor little boy.
Despite everything, she still feels bad for Walter. I think this is a combination of her natural sympathy along with Walter's influence. Eventually she becomes possessed, but how much depends on how well you take care of her. If she takes only a little damage, there's only the occasional hint that Walter's memories are invading her mind.
I used the subway all the time when I was younger. I can read this writing. It looks like some kind of a diary.
Which is all that ever happens when I play, because I always play on the easy level and I don't have the heart to let her get hurt anyway. Some sickos like to see how badly messed up she can get to see how it changes her. She reverts into Walter as a kid at times, and things only get worse from there.
Henry!
It turns out that she can't go through the portals like Henry can, so you're stuck with her for the rest of the game.
Have you been here the whole time?
Yeah? And I didn't see any hole either. You just disappeared all of a sudden. I can't stay here by myself. I'll be cursed. I know it. What am I gonna do?
But on the upside, you can ditch her occasionally, since she can't climb ladders, and she does help you fight the monsters. So for all her faults, she can be an asset at times. Eileen represents the Mother Reborn. She does have some motherly qualities, but it seems like an odd choice since she was a little kid when Walter met her. I guess he stalked her into adulthood too. Yeah, still creepy.
I remember now. I was getting ready to go to my friend's party. The boy protected me from the man with the coat.
Of course, there are a lot of other victims since they were meant to be 21 in all, but the rest we don't learn that much about, and they mostly show up as ghosts. But the last victim before Cynthia does show up in a way, mostly through the notes from him that you find throughout the apartment. I'm talking about Joseph Schreiber, who lived in the apartment before Henry. Aside from the notes, we also hear some things from Richard and Eileen, who knew about him but probably didn't know him on a personal level, kind of like our protagonist.
He was the guy who lived in your apartment before you.
A journalist. He disappeared one day.
About 6 months before you moved in.
He got pretty crazy towards the end. Shut himself up in his room and wouldn't come out?
Yeah. He was doing an investigation. about a religious cult and a man named Walter Sullivan.
He also wrote the famous Hope House article that you come across in Silent Hill 3 that turns out to be part of Walter's past. The game doesn't make it completely clear what his fate was, but clearly he was killed in some method because he's nowhere to be found until this cutscene towards the end.
It's him.
You've done well to make it this far.
By the way, that sequence in the beginning of the game, you're actually playing as Joseph there, not Henry. It is made to look like he died at the end, but death by ghost doesn't really fit with Walter's MO. But who knows? Either way, he helps you out from beyond the grave.
Even now, it may not be too late. Follow the crimson tome. Stop him. If not, wherever you run, he will catch you.
So all of that brings us to Walter Sullivan. In some ways he boils down to a typical serial killer. He could almost be called a spree killer or a mass murderer, but according to the research I did, he fits the description of a serial killer best. Intelligent? Well, he went to med school, which takes a certain amount of intelligence, so check. Speaking of that, it's not unusual for them to be doctors, but that's mostly for mercy killers. They tend to come from unstable families. Having no family is about as unstable as you can get. As children, they are often abandoned by their fathers and raised by domineering mothers. More like abandoned by both parents and raised by a domineering guardian of sorts, but close enough. Their families often have criminal, psychiatric, and alcoholic histories. No idea, but his father does come off like an abuser.
Little crybaby.
They were often abused by a family member. Again, a guardian. Check this one out. From an early age, many are intensely interested in voyeurism, which we don't actually witness Walter doing much, but it is one of the main themes in the game. Many are fascinated by fire starting. Don't know if it's a fascination, but he's not above using fire as a murder weapon. They are involved in sadistic activity or torturing animals. Well, he did destroy a pet store full of animals. No details are given, but the newspaper article described it as butchering, so it had to have been pretty brutal. They mostly grew up in poverty. He mainly lived alternately in a cabin and a concrete cell, then became homeless. They were frequently bullied as children. Big check. Anyway, I could go on, but this isn't Serial Killers 101. I just found it interesting how much he fits the description of a real-life serial killers and thought I'd share. Team Silent did their homework as usual. So here's a quick rundown of the history of Walter Sullivan. As a newborn baby, he was abandoned by his parents in their apartment, which would later be the apartment of Joseph Schreiber and after that Henry Townsend. Since the apartment was the first thing he saw, it became imprinted on him and he saw it as his mother, probably more like a second womb. But he was taken away from his mother and taken to a hospital, which he apparently remembers as being pretty scary. Which makes sense for someone so young who just wanted to be with his mother who was nowhere to be found. Just isn't the Silent Hill game without a hospital level. He was handed over to an orphanage that was unfortunately run by the cult from the previous games. Possibly a different sect, but with similar beliefs. Their goal is to revive a god who will destroy the world,
Of course.
and kill all the non-believers before leading the believers to paradise. Of course he was abused. It's the first step to brainwashing. A common form of abuse was to lock up the kids in a concrete tower where they possibly killed some of them, though this could be due to Walter being an unreliable narrator. Either way, the cultists went out of their way to make Walter's life absolutely miserable. I think Claudia's rants from Silent Hill 3 sum up their motives pretty well.
But I thank you for nurturing God with all the hate in your heart. It's time for mankind to be released from the shackles of sin which bind them.
What's worse is that hers is the romanticized version of the cult's release. Take away her intention to do the right thing in the end, and it gets really dark.
To save mankind.
Walter eventually learned that he could take the subway to find his mother. In fact, he was encouraged by the cultists, likely by Dahlia Gillespie herself, to go and do this as part of their brainwashing. They fill his head with ideas about how horrible the outside world is, then they let him see for himself. And he sees it exactly the way they intended. It helps that he perpetually ran into people who treated him badly. In the subway station, in the city, and the apartment building. Meanwhile, the cultists made him learn the 21 sacraments and descent of the Holy Mother scriptures, making him believe that he would revive his mother, but instead he's reviving the cult's god. And he was too steeped in his own delusions to realize this. I mean, he thought his mother was an apartment, for God's sake. Or rather, he chose to believe that because it sounded better than the truth. That the only people he had in the world abandoned him to a bunch of abusers who were turning him into a monster. It sucks to be Walter. Once he was old enough to leave the orphanage, he went into studying medicine. I think I made a comment about something like this in a previous Game Den episode. There's just something so unsettling about a deranged doctor. Something about all that knowledge of human anatomy being put in the wrong hands. Yeah. So why did he go into medicine? Well, my guess would be that he wanted to perform the 21 sacraments with as much precision as possible. But who knows? Remember this scene where we see him operating on a woman's corpse? What is he doing there? Is he removing her uterus? Is he performing some kind of abortion? One theory is that he studied medicine so he could learn how to perform abortion so he could save babies from having to go through what he did. I don't know about that. He seems a little more self-centered than that to me. Another is that he just got his kicks from dissecting bodies. Sure sounds like he's having fun. Yeah. Take a good look, Walter Sullivan fangirls. While you're fantasizing about comforting the poor Whoopi, he's fantasizing about cutting you open. Yeah, and here's something about Walter Sullivan I've noticed. He's misogynistic. Now, he kills a lot of people, and they all die pretty horrifically, but the most violent murders he attempts are on Cynthia and Eileen. One is stabbed to death, the other is nearly beaten to death. Now, his other victims probably suffer more, but these two take more physical energy to carry out, more rage. It makes sense, considering that just about all the women he's dealt with have treated him badly. Namely his birth mother, Cynthia, and maybe even Dahlia Gillespie. Not as directly as with the others, but it could be that deep down he knows he's being manipulated. And no, that is not a justification to slash him with Henry. Misogynistic does not mean gay. But I digress. As I've said before, most of the victims are people who have wronged Walter in some way, with the one glaring exception being Eileen, who is the only one to ever show him any kindness. She's second to the last victim. One has to wonder if she's basically the final test. Only if he kills and condemns the only person he ever cared about will he be worthy to complete the 21 sacraments, or something like that. Clearly he couldn't bring himself to finish beating her to death, so he sets it up so that she's compelled to walk into a set of rotating spikes. Seems a little like cheating. Again, whether she suffers this fate or not is up to you. And if you're thinking of letting her die just to see if it looks cool, don't bother, it happens off camera. So I've mostly been talking about Walter when he was alive, and the undead Walter that you have to deal with in the game. But there's a third incarnation.
Are you Walter Sullivan?
That's what everybody calls me, but I don't really have a name or a home either.
See, Walter committed suicide in his jail cell, making himself number 11 of the 21 sacraments. But once he resurrected himself, he ended up being split down the middle and taking two forms. One is of the inhuman killing machine, who is an adult and probably looks the way Walter looked when he was alive. The other is a child who represents his desire to be with his mother and looks the way Walter looked at that age. But which is the good one and which is the bad one? Seems obvious at first glance. The big one that can kill you is evil, and the little cute one is good. But consider that there are 3 cases where we see little Walter interacting with another character. Jasper scares him, Richard threatens him, and he just plain dislikes DeSalvo, though we don't know why at first. And that character ends up dying horrifically. In the case of Richard, the kid is right there in the room with him and doesn't seem all that fazed by what's going on. In fact, it helps create a false feeling that Eileen dies too right after her attack because once again, the kid's right there. But as we find out later,
The boy protected me from the man with the coat.
it was little Walter who apparently stopped Big Walter from killing her. Silent Pyramid has an interesting theory. Little Walter, even though he seems all cute and nice, is mainly self-centered, and Big Walter is mainly just there to do what needs to be done so little Walter can get what he wants. He did save Eileen, but it could have been more along the lines of, "Don't kill this one, I like her." He points out that little Walter says words like I, me, and my about 15 times, along with a lot of other interesting little details to back up his opinion. But granted, little Walter shows a lot more humanity than Big Walter, who only has 2 very brief scenes that remind us that he's a human being. Or was. But at least he has those. Either way, they're two sides of the same coin, but what it comes down to is that it's not as black and white as one being good and the other being evil.
It's time to complete the 21 sacraments.
What are the 21 sacraments?
Don't worry. You'll know soon enough. Well, let's go and see Mother.